Beneath the most famous park in America lies a buried village. Homes, churches, a school, all demolished so that millions could one day walk where families once lived. Central Park took 20,000 workers, over 250,000 trees, and destroyed an entire community to create. Two dreamers fought politicians, corruption, and even each other to build something that was never supposed to last. This is the real story of how a suffocating city created an American masterpiece. Quick favour before we get into this. If you're watching from New York or anywhere in the States, or from across the pond in England, I'm genuinely curious where you're tuned in from. Drop your city and the time in the comments. There's something wild about knowing people from Brooklyn and Birmingham and Belfast are all drifting off to the same story at different hours. And yeah, if these help you sleep, a like or subscribe would be cool. No pressure. Alright, tonight we're heading back to New York City in the 1840s. But first, get yourself comfortable. I mean it. Fix those pillows. Pull up that blanket. Because where we're going, you're going to want to be cozy. Picture Manhattan in 1844. Not the glittering skyline you know. Not Times Square or skyscrapers or yellow cabs. Picture mud. Picture streets so thick with horse manure that wooden planks were laid down just so people could cross without sinking ankle deep. Picture factory smokestacks belching black clouds into a grey sky. Picture a city that smells like a combination of coal, rotting garbage, and about 500,000 people crammed into a space meant for maybe 50,000. Ships arrived daily at the harbour, unloading immigrants by the thousands, Irish families fleeing famine, German craftsmen looking for work. They poured off the boats with nothing but bundles of clothes and whatever hope they'd managed to keep alive during the ocean crossing, and the city just absorbed them. Somehow. Tenements rose overnight, 5 and 6 stories high, packed with families in rooms that never saw sunlight. Children played in alleys between the slaughterhouses and the factories, breathing air that left soot on their clothes and in their lungs. The noise was relentless. Horses' hooves on cobblestone, street vendors shouting prices, the clatter of cartwheels, the rhythmic pounding from metalworks. There was no escape from it. Not during the day, barely at night. New York City was suffocating, and there was one man who couldn't stop thinking about it. His name was William Cullen Bryant, and in 1844 he was already one of the most famous writers in America. You might have heard his poems in school. Thanatopsis, maybe. Heavy stuff about death and nature and finding peace in the wilderness. Bryant wasn't just a poet, though. He ran the New York Evening Post, one of the biggest newspapers in the city. He had power. He had influence. And he had this idea that wouldn't leave him alone. Picture Bryant himself for a moment. 50 years old, white beard, getting longer every year, deep-set eyes that could stare down politicians and business rivals alike. He'd started out as a lawyer in Massachusetts but hated every minute of it. Poetry saved him. Journalism gave him a platform. And now he had become one of those rare figures in American life who could shape public opinion just by putting words on paper. Every morning, Bryant walked to work, through the crowded streets, past the beggars and the bootblacks, through the stench of the fish markets and the tanneries, and every morning he thought the same thought. Where, he kept asking, could a New Yorker go to breathe? Think about that for a second. Here's this wealthy, educated man, living in the greatest city on the American continent, and he's asking a question that sounds like it's coming from someone trapped in a prison cell. Where could a person go to breathe? The answer, in 1844, was basically nowhere. Manhattan had these tiny squares scattered around. Little patches of grass where kids kicked balls between vegetable carts and stray dogs. The biggest public green space in the whole city was Battery Park, down at the southern tip of the island. 10 acres. That's it. 10 acres for 500,000 people. Do the math on that one. That's about the size of 7 football fields for a city bursting at the seams. Meanwhile, Bryant had travelled. He'd been to London. He'd walked through Hyde Park, all 350 acres of it. He'd seen families spreading blankets on the grass, rich and poor sharing the same shade. He'd watched riders trotting down Rotten Row, surrounded by green so pure it almost hurt to look at after the grey of city streets. He'd been to Paris too, the Bois de Boulogne, where fancy Parisians rode horses through meadows and picnicked under oak trees. These weren't just parks, they were statements. They were proof that a city could be civilized, that people deserved beauty. And he came back to New York thinking, we're supposed to be this great new nation, this land of democracy and progress, and we can't even give our people a decent park. So on a summer day in 1844, Bryant sat down at his desk at the Evening Post and wrote an editorial that would change the shape of New York forever. He called for what he described as an extensive pleasure ground, a place where citizens could escape the noise and dirt, a place where a working man could walk among trees and feel, for just an hour, like he wasn't being slowly crushed by the city. Bryant was careful about his words. He knew his audience. He knew that rich New Yorkers cared about their city's reputation. So he played that angle. London has parks, he wrote. Paris has parks. What does New York have? The editorial landed like a stone in still water. Now, Bryant wasn't alone in this thinking. Another man had been dreaming the same dream, maybe even bigger. His name was Andrew Jackson Downing, and if Bryant was the voice of the park movement, Downing was its imagination. Downing was a landscape designer from up the Hudson River in Newburgh. He grew up around trees and gardens, working in his family's nursery business. By his late 20s, he'd written books that basically invented American landscape architecture. He had this vision for what public spaces could be. Not just squares with grass and benches, but designed landscapes that would actually move people, change them, make them better humans just by walking through. Downing looked at New York's so-called parks and basically laughed. What are called parks in New York, he wrote in his magazine, are not even apologies for the thing. They are only squares or paddocks. Paddocks, like where you keep horses. That's what he thought of New York's green spaces. Downing wanted something on the scale of 500 acres. Minimum. He wanted lakes and meadows and winding paths through forests. He wanted a park that would make European visitors shut up about how uncultured Americans were. He wanted a park that would teach the working class how to behave in public, which sounds pretty condescending now, but that's how a lot of reform-minded folks thought back then. Between Bryant's newspaper and Downing's reputation, the idea started to gain traction. Other wealthy New Yorkers joined in. Merchants who'd done the grand tour of Europe. Shipping magnates who were embarrassed that foreign visitors saw nothing but tenements and stockyards. Politicians who saw which way the wind was blowing. In 1850, the park question became the hot topic in the mayoral race. Both candidates promised to make it happen. Think about that. In the middle of debates about immigration and crime and sewage and all the problems of a city growing way too fast, people were arguing about trees and grass. Mayor Caleb Woodhull pointed out that the public squares below 42nd Street added up to only 63 acres. That was less than 1/4 the size of just one of London's major parks. We look ridiculous was basically his argument, And New Yorkers, whatever else they might be, do not like looking ridiculous. The momentum was building. But there was a problem. Actually, there were a lot of problems. First, where do you put a park that big? Manhattan is an island, a narrow one. Real estate was already valuable, even in the parts that were mostly swamp and rock. Every acre you set aside for a park was an acre you weren't using for buildings and businesses and tax revenue. The wealthy merchants who wanted the park weren't exactly volunteering their own property. Second, who pays for it? The city was always broke. Infrastructure was falling apart. Police were understaffed, and somebody wanted to spend millions on meadows and lakes. Third, and this is the part that gets forgotten, the land they were eyeing wasn't empty, but we'll get to that. For now, focus on the dreamers. Bryant and Downing, imagining this impossible green space in the middle of a city that was choking on its own success. Bryant had originally suggested a spot called Jones Wood, 150 acres of pretty countryside along the East River between 66th and 75th Streets. It had trees, it had water views, it had charm. The state legislature actually authorized the city to take it through eminent domain in 1851. But Downing thought Joneswood was way too small. A child's playground, he called it. If you're going to do this, do it right. 500 acres minimum. While they debated, the politicians manoeuvred. A special committee recommended a different site altogether. A stretch of land in the centre of the island, from 59th Street up to 106th Street, between 5th Avenue and 8th Avenue. More than 700 acres of what was, on paper, basically worthless terrain. On paper, rocky, swampy in places, far from the developed parts of the city. Some people called it the empty centre, the land nobody wanted, except, of course, for the people who already lived there. By 1853, the New York State Legislature had made its decision. They chose the central site. The city would acquire the land and build America's first great public park. Bryant and Downing had won, sort of. The dream was real. Or it would be, once they dealt with all the messy details. Andrew Jackson Downing wouldn't live to see any of it. In July of 1852, he was travelling down the Hudson River on a steamboat called the Henry Clay. Steamboats were the highways of the era. Faster than roads, cheaper than railroads for short distances. But they were also dangerous. Boilers exploded, fires broke out, and steamboat captains were notorious for racing each other, pushing their vessels way past safe speeds, all to prove something that nobody needed proved. The Henry Clay was racing another boat, the Armenia, when fire broke out near the engine room. The flames spread fast. Passengers screamed. Some jumped into the river. The captain, instead of heading for shore immediately, kept trying to reach the shallows where survivors might have a chance. But the fire was faster than his judgment. Downing was on deck when the flames reached him. He'd been helping other passengers, some said. Others said he froze. We'll never know. The boat was close enough to shore that some passengers jumped into the shallow water and survived. 80 people didn't, including Andrew Jackson Downing. He was 36 years old, at the height of his powers, with his greatest work still undesigned. Bryant mourned his friend. The whole landscape movement mourned. Here was the man who could have designed the greatest park in America, dead before he could pick up a pencil. The newspapers ran tributes. His widow was devastated. His colleagues wondered what might have been. But the dream didn't die with him. In fact, Downing's death might have saved the project, because it created an opening for two men who had known Downing, who had absorbed his ideas who would take his vision and turn it into something even he might not have imagined. One was a British architect who had worked in Downing's firm, a meticulous craftsman with an eye for detail and a passion for the relationship between buildings and landscape. The other was a man who, at that moment, didn't even know he was going to be a park designer. A man who had failed at farming, struggled as a journalist, and was looking for any steady work he could find. Their names were Calvert Vaux and Frederick Law Olmsted, and together they would build the most famous park in America. But first, the city had to clear the land, and clearing the land meant dealing with the people who were already there. The people nobody in the fancy drawing rooms of Lower Manhattan wanted to talk about. The newspapers called them squatters, vagabonds, shantytown dwellers. The newspapers were lying. Among those 700 acres were farms and small settlements, German immigrants who had carved out homesteads, Irish families who had fled famine. And in the western section, around what is now the area between 82nd and 89th Streets, there was a village, a real village, with homes and streets and churches, and most of its residents were black Americans who owned their land outright. They had titles, they paid taxes, they voted, those who qualified under the property requirements that New York State imposed on black voters. They had built something in that rocky, swampy, supposedly worthless terrain, something that mattered, something that was theirs. Their story is the one that almost got erased from history, the village beneath the park, the community that had to disappear so that millions of others could enjoy the grass and the lakes and the carefully designed views. That story deserves its own telling. Right now, you're probably somewhere comfortable. Warm blankets around you, maybe. Pillow adjusted just right. The noise of your day starting to fade into the background. Your body settling into whatever position feels best tonight. That's something those New Yorkers in 1844 would have understood. The craving for comfort, the need for peace, the desperate hope that somewhere, somehow, there's a place where you can just rest for a while. Bryant understood it. Downing understood it. They saw their city struggling under its own weight and imagined something different. A space where the noise stopped, where the air was clean, where a person could sit on a bench and watch clouds drift overhead and feel, for just a moment, that everything might be okay. In 1853, New York City was about to do something it would spend the next 150 years trying to forget. Something that would make the creation of Central Park possible, but at a cost that rarely shows up in the guidebooks. A cost paid by families who had done nothing wrong except live on land that other people wanted. The politicians had their sight. The dreamers had their vision. Now came the hard part. Now came the families who had to leave. On September 27th, 1825, a 25-year-old man named Andrew Williams walked into a lawyer's office in Lower Manhattan and did something that most people in his position could only dream about. He bought land, 3 lots, $125, cash. Now, $125 doesn't sound like much today, but in 1825, for a black man in New York City, it was everything. Andrew Williams worked as a boot black. You know what that is? He shined shoes, knelt down on the street corners of Manhattan, brush and polish in hand, making rich men's boots gleam for a few pennies at a time. And somehow, penny by penny, shine by shine, he'd saved up enough to buy himself a piece of America. The land he bought was way up north of the city, in an area that most New Yorkers considered the middle of nowhere. Rocky terrain, swampy in places, no roads to speak of, Just rolling hills and scattered boulders and a natural spring called Tanner's Spring that burbled up through the rocks. Most white New Yorkers wouldn't have given you a nickel for it. Andrew Williams saw something else entirely. He saw freedom. See, here's what you have to understand about New York in 1825. Slavery had just ended in the state. Just ended. 2 years earlier. The final emancipation law kicked in on July 4th, 1827, but the process had been gradual, and by 25, most black New Yorkers were technically free. Technically. Because free didn't mean equal, not even close. Free meant you could work. Free meant you weren't literally owned by another person. But free didn't mean you could vote. Free didn't mean you could live where you wanted. Free didn't mean anyone had to rent to you, sell to you, or treat you like a human being. Unless you owned property. New York State had this rule. Black men could vote, but only if they owned at least $250 worth of property and had paid taxes on it for 3 years. White men, no property requirement, just show up. But black men had to prove they had a stake in the community, had to prove they belonged. Andrew Williams, kneeling on those street corners, shining those boots, understood the game. He couldn't change the rules, but he could play them. So he bought land, and he wasn't alone. The same week Andrew Williams signed his papers, a man named Epiphany Davis walked into the same lawyer's office. Davis worked as a clerk at a feed store. Steady job, decent pay. And he had bigger plans than Andrew Williams. Epiphany. Davis bought 12 lots. $578. That's almost 5 times what Williams paid. And right. Behind Davis came the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. The AME Zion was one of the most important black churches in New York. They'd been looking for land outside the cramped, hostile streets of Lower Manhattan, somewhere their congregation could gather without being harassed, somewhere they could bury their dead in peace. They bought 6 lots. Within a week, 21 parcels of that rocky, swampy, supposedly worthless land had new owners. And those owners were going to build something. They called it Seneca Village. Nobody knows for sure where the name came from. Maybe after the Seneca Nation, the indigenous people whose territory once covered much of western New York. Maybe after the Roman philosopher Seneca, whose writings about dignity and freedom were popular among abolitionists. Either way, the name stuck, and the village grew. By 1832, the original landowners had sold about half their parcels to other black families. Word spread through the black communities of Lower Manhattan. There's land up north, cheap, space to breathe, a place where you can own something. Imagine that for a second. Imagine living in a tenement so crowded that 6 families share one outhouse. Imagine walking streets where white men spit at you, where landlords charge you double rent because they know you've got nowhere else to go. Imagine working 12, 14 hours a day and still barely scraping by, and then someone tells you there's a village, up north, where black folks own their own homes, where your kids can play in yards instead of alleys, where you can plant a garden and keep chickens and wake up to the sound of birds instead of factory whistles. You'd go. Of course you'd go. They built homes, simple ones at first, wood frame, maybe a basement dug into the rocky soil. But homes, they're homes. With front doors they could lock and windows they could open and roofs that kept the rain off their children's heads. Some families kept livestock, pigs, chickens, maybe a goat or 2. They had gardens where they grew vegetables. They fished in the Hudson River, which wasn't that far away. Tanner's spring gave them fresh water, cool and clear, bubbling up through the rocks like a gift. Picture what a morning might have looked like. Smoke rising from chimneys, kids running between houses on their way to school, women hanging laundry on lines strung between trees, men heading off to work in the city or tending their plots of land, church bells ringing on Sundays. Normal stuff. The kind of normal that gets taken for granted until someone takes it away. They built churches, 3 of them eventually. The AME Zion established a proper chapel in the village. All Angels Church, an Episcopal mission, went up in 1849. The African Union Church built their own structure around 1840. 3 churches for a village that never held more than 300 people. That tells you something about what mattered to them. Faith, community, having a place to gather that belonged to them. They built a school, Coloured School Number 3 the city called it, but for the kids of Seneca Village, it was just school. A place to learn reading and writing and arithmetic. A place to become something more than what the world expected you to be. And here's the thing that really gets me. By 1855, when the census takers came through, nearly half the residents of Seneca Village owned their own homes. Half. In a city where most black New Yorkers rented cramped rooms in the worst neighborhoods, here was a community where families owned property, had deeds, had stakes in the future. Andrew Williams was still there. 30 years after buying those first 3 lots, now in his 50s, he was an elder of the community, a property owner, a voter, everything that 25-year-old bootblack had dreamed about. But Seneca Village wasn't just black families. By the 1840s, Irish immigrants had started moving in too. The potato famine was driving millions out of Ireland, and they landed in New York with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the desperate need for somewhere, anywhere, to live. Some of them found their way up to Seneca Village. Different as they were, the black families and Irish families had something in common. They were both hated by mainstream New York, both considered outsiders, both struggling to build lives in a city that didn't want them. So they lived side by side, not always in perfect harmony. Nobody's pretending it was some utopia. But they shared the same rocky ground, the same spring water, the same churches sometimes. The 1855 census shows the village was about 2/3 black, 1/3 Irish, with a handful of German families mixed in. It worked. For 32 years, it worked. And then the city decided it wanted their land. The first signs came in 1853, when the state legislature approved the creation of Central Park. Seneca Village sat right in the middle of the proposed site. The residents must have heard the news, must have talked about it at church, over dinner tables while tending their gardens. Maybe they hoped it wouldn't happen. Maybe they believed that property rights meant something. They had deeds, after all. Legal documents. They'd played by the rules, done everything right. The city sent assessors in 1855, men with clipboards walking through the village, measuring properties, writing down numbers. The residents watched them, probably with that sick feeling you get when you know something bad is coming but can't do anything to stop it. Then the offers came. Andrew Williams was offered $2,335 for his house and 3 lots. He'd paid $125 30 years earlier, so on paper that sounds like a good deal. But Williams had asked for $3,500. He knew what his property was worth. He knew what they were taking from him. It wasn't just land. It was 30 years of his life, the house he'd built, the community he'd helped create, the voting rights that came with ownership. the future he'd planned. The newspapers didn't see it that way. As the evictions approached, the papers started running stories about the shanty town that occupied the park site. They called the residents squatters, vagabonds, nuisances that needed to be cleared out for the public good. Squatters, people with legal deeds to their property, people who'd paid taxes for decades. Squatters. You see how that works? You dehumanize people first, make them seem like they don't belong, and then taking everything from them isn't theft. It's cleanup. The eviction started in 1856 and stretched into 57. Some families left quietly, took their money, tried to start over somewhere else. Others fought. They had lawyers. They had legal standing. They had rights. Imagine being one of those families. You've lived somewhere for 20 years, raised your children there, buried your parents in the church cemetery. You know every rock, every tree, every neighbour by name. And now men in suits are telling you that the greater good requires you to leave, that your home is worth less than a public park, that your community doesn't matter as much as carriage paths for rich folks. Some residents refused to go, barricaded themselves in their homes, said they weren't leaving without a fight. The police came with bludgeons. One newspaper reported with no apparent irony that the supremacy of the law was upheld by the policeman's bludgeons. That's an actual quote. The supremacy of the law, upheld by beating people off land they legally owned. By the end of 1857, Seneca Village was gone, not abandoned, demolished. The city sent workers to tear down the homes, the churches, the school. They pulled up the foundations and carted away the rubble. They wanted the land clear, ready for the great park that would rise in its place. Andrew Williams took his $2,300 and disappeared from history. We don't know where he went. We don't know if he bought land somewhere else, if he managed to rebuild, if he ever recovered from losing everything he'd spent his life creating. Same with most of the other residents. A few might have gone to Sandy Ground, a black community on Staten Island. Some might have joined Skunk Hollow in New Jersey. Most just vanished into the crowded streets of a city that didn't want to remember they'd ever existed. For over 100 years, nobody talked about Seneca Village. The guidebooks didn't mention it. The park histories glossed over it or repeated the squatter narrative. It wasn't until the 1990s that historians started digging into the records, finding the census data, the property deeds, the church records, piecing together the story of the village that had been erased in two. 2011, archaeologists actually excavated part of the site. They found foundations, stone walls still buried beneath the soil, household items, dishes, buttons, bottles, a toothbrush, smoking pipes, the kinds of ordinary objects that ordinary people use in their ordinary lives, and a child's shoe sole, just the leather bottom of some kid's shoe, left behind when everything else was destroyed. I don't know why that detail hits so hard. Maybe because it makes it real. A child wore that shoe, walked to school in it, played in the yard in it, and then one day the family had to leave, and somehow that shoe got left behind, buried under the rubble, forgotten for 150 years. Now it sits in a museum somewhere, evidence that Seneca Village was real, that real people lived there, that the squatter story was a lie. If you go to Central Park today, there's a spot near the West 85th Street entrance, rolling hills, a rock outcropping called Summit Rock, which is the highest natural point in the entire park. It's pretty, peaceful. Joggers pass through, dog walkers, people with no idea what used to be there. Seneca Village, where Andrew Williams bought 3 lots for $125 and dared to dream he could own a piece of America, where Epiphany Davis and the AME Zion Church planted the seeds of a community, where black families and Irish immigrants lived side by side in a city that despised them both, where children went to school and couples got married and old folks sat on porches watching the seasons change. All of it gone, demolished, paved over with carriage roads and planted with trees that tourists now photograph. The park that would rise from that ground would be beautiful, genuinely, staggeringly beautiful. It would give millions of New Yorkers exactly what William Cullen Bryant had dreamed of: a place to breathe, a place to escape, a democratic space where rich and poor could walk the same paths. But it was built on something that should never be forgotten. The people who made Central Park possible weren't just the designers and the politicians and the workers who moved the rocks and planted the trees. They were also the families who lost everything so that dream could happen. The ones who never got monuments or plaques or chapters in history books. Andrew Williams deserves to be remembered. So does Epiphany Davis. So do all the unnamed men and women and children who built Seneca Village from nothing and watched it torn down by people who called them squatters. Your bed is probably feeling pretty good right now. Soft, safe, yours. Imagine if someone decided they wanted that spot. If they came with lawyers and assessors and eventually police. If they called you names in the newspaper and said you didn't really belong there anyway. That's what happened to Seneca Village. The city had its land now, 700 acres of rocky, swampy terrain, cleared of the people who'd called it home. The dreamers had won. The politicians had won. Now they just had to figure out what to do with it. That's where two very different men come in. One of them was a trained architect from England who had worked for Andrew Jackson Downing himself. The other was a failed farmer from Connecticut who wasn't sure what he was supposed to do with his life. Their partnership would create the most famous park in America. But nobody knew that yet. In 1857, they were just two guys with an idea and a competition to win. Frederick Law Olmsted was 35 years old in 1857, and he had no idea what he was supposed to do with his life. This wasn't for lack of trying. The man had tried everything, failed at most of it, kept getting up and trying something else. He'd been a sailor. At 19, he shipped out to China on a merchant vessel, spending months at sea, learning the hard way that romantic visions of ocean voyages didn't match the reality of seasickness, bad food, and endless boredom punctuated by moments of genuine terror. He came back thinner, tougher, and absolutely certain he didn't want to be a sailor. He'd been a farmer. His father, a successful Hartford merchant who genuinely loved his son, bought him a 125-acre farm on Staten Island in 1848. Olmsted threw himself into it, read all the latest books on scientific agriculture, imported fancy pear trees from France, experimented with drainage systems and crop rotations. He even sold shade trees to his neighbours and got a bit of a reputation for knowing how to place buildings and landscaping on a property. The farm never really made money, but Olmsted kept at it for years, convinced that this was his calling. It wasn't. He'd been a journalist. In 1852, the New York Times hired him to travel through the American South and write about what he saw. This was before the Civil War, remember. The country was tearing itself apart over slavery, and most Northerners had no idea what life was actually like in the slave states. Olmsted spent months traveling through Virginia, the Carolinas, Louisiana, Texas. He talked to plantation owners and enslaved people and poor white farmers. He wrote it all down. The articles became books. The books became important. For a while, Olmsted was one of the most respected voices explaining the South to the North. He'd been a publisher. In 1855, he became managing editor of Putnam's Monthly Magazine, one of the big literary journals of the day. He worked with famous writers, made important friends, lost a lot of money when the publishing firm went bankrupt in the Panic of '57. By the summer of that year, Olmsted was broke, unemployed, and living on the fumes of his reputation. His farm was failing. His publishing career was dead. His books about the South weren't selling like they used to. He had a wife and young stepchildren to support, and no clear path forward. And then a friend mentioned that they were hiring a superintendent for that new park project in Manhattan. Superintendent, not designer. Olmsted wasn't applying to create Central Park. He was applying to supervise the workers who were clearing the land. It was basically a construction management job. Make sure the labourers showed up, keep the equipment working, file reports with the park commissioners. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid. Olmsted pulled every string he could. He got letters of recommendation from Washington Irving, the most famous American writer of the age, from newspaper editors, from politicians, from anyone who might impress the commissioners. In September 1857, he got the job. Picture him showing up for work that first week. The land that would become Central Park was a mess. Rocky outcroppings everywhere, swamps in the low spots, the ruins of Seneca Village still being cleared away. Squatters' shacks and pig farms scattered across the site. It looked less like a future park and more like the aftermath of something. A disaster, maybe, or a war. Olmsted's job was to impose order on this chaos, hire workers, organise them into crews, start moving rocks and draining swamps. Basic stuff. But here's the thing about Olmsted. He couldn't just do the basic stuff. His mind didn't work that way. As he walked the land day after day, he started seeing something. Not what was there, but what could be there. The rocky outcroppings weren't obstacles. They were features. The swamps weren't problems. They were future lakes. The rolling terrain wasn't difficult. It was dramatic. He'd seen something like this before. Back in 1850, when he was still pretending to be a farmer, Olmsted had taken a trip to England. He'd visited the gardens and estates that wealthy Englishmen had been perfecting for centuries. He'd seen Hyde Park in London, where carriages rolled through on sunny afternoons and nannies pushed prams along gravel paths. Pretty enough, but nothing special. But the place that really stuck with him was Birkenhead Park, across the river from Liverpool. Birkenhead was special. It wasn't a royal garden open to the public. It was designed from the start as a people's park, open to everyone, rich and poor walking the same paths. The designer, Joseph Paxton, had created winding trails that made the small space feel endless. He'd hidden the roads so that visitors could walk for miles without seeing a single carriage. He'd mixed open meadows with dense groves of trees, creating variety and surprise around every corner. There were lakes with swans, rustic bridges, carefully placed rocks that looked wild but weren't. Olmsted had walked through Birkenhead with his mouth hanging open. 5 minutes, he later wrote, and he was ready to admit that in democratic America there was nothing like this. No public space designed with this much care, this much art for ordinary people. He went home and wrote a book about his travels. Walks and Talks of an American Farmer in England, he called it. The section about Birkenhead was the part people remembered. Now, 7 years later, standing on the rocky hills of what would become Central Park, Olmsted remembered Birkenhead. And he started to wonder, What if this wasn't just a construction job? What if this was the chance to build something that mattered? Meanwhile, there was this other guy, an architect named Calvert Vaux. Vaux was English. Born in London in 1824, trained under one of the great Gothic Revival architects, brought to America in 1850 by Andrew Jackson Downing himself. Remember Downing? The landscape designer who died in that steamboat fire? Vaux had been his partner, his protégé, the architect who was supposed to help Downing revolutionize American landscape design. And then Downing died, and Vaux was left alone. For 5 years, Vaux had been building houses and working on small projects, waiting for his chance at something bigger. When the Central Park Commission announced a design competition in 1857, Vaux saw his opportunity. But he needed a partner. Vaux was an architect, not a landscape designer. He knew buildings. He knew how structures related to their surroundings. But he didn't have the vision for the land itself. He didn't have the feel for how meadows should flow into forests, how water should catch the light, how paths should lead people through an experience. He needed someone who understood land the way he understood buildings. He needed Olmsted. The two men had met through Downing's circle. They weren't close friends, but they respected each other. Vaux knew that Olmsted had travelled, had seen the great parks of Europe, had ideas about what public spaces could be, and Olmsted was right there, on the ground, walking the site every day, seeing possibilities that nobody else could see. In the fall of 1857, Vaux approached Olmsted with a proposition. Enter the competition together. Combine Vaux's architectural skills with Olmsted's vision for the landscape. Create something neither of them could create alone. Olmsted hesitated. He was already working for the Park Commission. Would it be appropriate for the superintendent to enter a design competition? Would people think he was using his position to get an advantage? But the pull was too strong. This was a chance to do something real, to take all those ideas that had been bouncing around his head since Birkenhead and actually put them on paper. He said yes. For months they worked, nights and weekends, because Olmsted still had his day job supervising the construction crews. They spread maps across Vaux's dining room table. They sketched and argued and erased and started over. They walked the site together in the cold autumn mornings and the early spring evenings, pointing at rocks and hollows, imagining what could be. Vaux brought the architectural precision, the bridges, the terraces, the way buildings would sit in the landscape. Olmsted brought the sweep and flow, the way paths would curve, the way views would open and close, the way a visitor would feel moving through the space. They were opposites in many ways. Vaux was quiet, methodical, detail-oriented. Olmsted was expansive, emotional, always thinking about the big picture. They argued constantly, but somehow the arguments made the design better. Every idea got tested. Every assumption got questioned. Their plan was radical. They called it the Greensward Plan. The name itself was a statement. Greensward meant grass, open lawn, a carpet of green stretching across the landscape. In a city of brick and stone and mud, they were proposing a sea of green. But it was more than just grass. They designed 2 great meadows, one in the south, one in the north. Open spaces big enough for thousands of people to spread blankets and feel like they were in the countryside. They designed a lake. Actually, they designed several. The biggest one would stretch across the middle of the park, fed by a system of streams and cascades. Rowboats would drift across the water. Families would picnic on the shores. They designed a ramble. A wild, wooded section on the north shore of the lake where paths would twist through rocks and trees, where you could get lost for an hour and forget you were in Manhattan. They designed a mall, a formal promenade lined with elm trees, the one straight line in a park full of curves, a place for the fashionable crowds to see and be seen. And here's the genius part. They designed the roads to disappear. See, the commissioners had a problem. Central Park was going to cut across Manhattan like a wall. The city needed roads that could pass through the park, carrying carriages and commerce from one side to the other. Most designers just drew roads across the surface, accepting that the traffic would interrupt the park experience. Olmsted and Vaux said no. They sank the crosstown roads below the level of the park, dug trenches and lined them with stone walls, built bridges over them so that pedestrians could walk from one side of the park to the other without ever seeing a carriage. Think about that for a second. In 1857, before cars existed, they invented the highway underpass. They looked at a problem that everyone else accepted and said, what if we just refused to accept it? That's what made the Greenswood Plan different. It wasn't just pretty pictures. It was problem solving. It was engineering. It was design that served people instead of showing off. 33 plans were submitted to the competition. 33 visions of what Central Park could become. Some were formal, in the French style. Some were wild and romantic. Some were practical but boring. The commissioners reviewed them all. On April 28, 1858, they announced the winner. Plan number 33. The Greenswood Plan, Olmsted and Vaux. Olmsted, the failed farmer, the wandering journalist, the bankrupt publisher, was now the chief architect of Central Park. Vaux was named consulting architect. Together, they would build the most ambitious public works project in American history. But winning the competition was the easy part. Now they had to actually build the thing, and the thing was the land didn't want to cooperate. 700 acres of rock and swamp and stubborn Manhattan geology. The swamps needed to be drained. The rocks needed to be blasted. The soil needed to be hauled in because there wasn't enough good earth to plant a single tree. Plus, there were politics. The Park Commission was a mess of competing interests. Some commissioners genuinely believed in Olmsted and Vaux's vision. Others wanted to use the park contracts to reward their friends. Every decision became a fight. Every dollar was contested. And looming over everything was Tammany Hall, the Democratic Party political machine that ran New York City. Tammany didn't care about meadows and lakes. Tammany cared about jobs and contracts and kickbacks. A project this big, with this much money flowing through it, was irresistible to the bosses. Olmsted was about to learn that creating beauty is easy compared to protecting it. But that's a story for a little later. For now, picture him in the spring of 1858, standing on a rocky outcropping somewhere in the middle of the park site, holding his rolled-up plans, looking out over the chaos of construction. Workers swarming everywhere, horse carts hauling dirt, the sound of pickaxes and shovels, dust in the air. He's 36 years old. He's finally found the thing he's supposed to do with his life. Everything before this, all the failures and experiments and wandering, has led to this moment. He doesn't know it yet, but he's about to invent a profession, landscape architecture. It doesn't even have a name yet. He'll give it one. He doesn't know it yet, but he's about to spend the next 15 years fighting for this park. Fighting politicians and corruption and his own failing health, winning some battles, losing others, watching his dream get built, get damaged, get rebuilt. He doesn't know it yet, but he's standing at the beginning of something that will outlast everyone who ever tried to stop him. A park that will still be there 150 years later, still giving millions of people exactly what William Cullen Bryant dreamed about all those years ago. A place to breathe. Your pillow's probably feeling nice right now. That perfect spot you've found. The weight of the day lifting off bit by bit. Olmsted found his thing. It took 36 years and a dozen false starts, but he found it. Now he had to build it. 20,000 workers would dig and blast and plant over the next decade. They'd move more rock than any project in American history. They'd plant 250,000 trees and shrubs. They'd carve lakes out of swamps and meadows out of wilderness, and most of them would be immigrants. Irish and German men who had fled famine and revolution, looking for work in a city that didn't always want them. Men who'd crossed an ocean with nothing, and now found themselves reshaping the very ground beneath their feet. They'd build the most famous park in America with their hands and their backs and their sweat. Some of them would get hurt. Some of them would die. Blasting powder doesn't care how hard you're working or how many kids you have at home. Their names weren't recorded. Their stories weren't told. But without them, there'd be no Central Park. Just drawings on paper and dreams that never came true. That's where we're going next. Down into the dirt with the men who did the actual work. His name is lost to history, so let's call him Patrick. Patrick came to New York in 1849 on a coffin ship from County Cork. He was 17 years old. His parents were dead. The potato blight had seen to that. 3 years of watching the crop turn to black mush in the ground. 3 years of eating grass and seaweed and anything else that wouldn't kill you immediately. His mother went first, then his father, then his 2 younger sisters within a week of each other. Patrick survived. Barely. He sold everything the family had left, which wasn't much, and bought passage on a ship called the Elizabeth. 42 days across the Atlantic, packed into a hold with 200 other desperate souls. The ship's water went bad halfway across. Typhus broke out. 18 people died before they reached New York Harbor. Patrick didn't die. He was good at not dying. It was basically his only skill. When he stumbled off the ship at the South Street docks, he had no money, no connections, no trade, and no idea what he was supposed to do next. He spoke English, which was more than some of the Irish could say. He was young and strong, despite the hunger that had hollowed out his cheeks. He found work on the docks, loading and unloading cargo, back-breaking labour for pennies a day. He slept in a boarding house so crowded that men took shifts in the beds. He ate whatever he could afford, which wasn't much. He sent nothing home because there was nobody left to send it to. For 8 years, Patrick survived. He worked the docks. He dug ditches. He hauled bricks on construction sites. He did whatever work was available to an Irishman in a city that posted signs saying, "No Irish need apply." And then, in 1857, he heard about a new project up in the middle of Manhattan. Some kind of park. They needed workers. Lots of workers. The pay wasn't great, but it was steady. Patrick walked up to the site and signed on. He had no idea he was about to help build something that would outlast everything else he'd ever touched. The construction site was chaos. Imagine 700 acres of rocky, swampy wilderness, and then imagine trying to turn it into a manicured landscape. That's what Olmsted and Vaux were asking these men to do. The first job was clearing, getting rid of everything that was already there. The remains of Seneca Village, the scattered shacks and pig farms, the bone-boiling operations that had set up shop in the remote areas, rendering animal carcasses into glue and fertilizer. The smell alone could knock you down from 50 yards away. Patrick and the other workers tore it all down, pulled apart buildings plank by plank, loaded the debris onto horse carts and hauled it away, filled in the cesspools and garbage pits that dotted the landscape. Then came the rocks. Manhattan is basically a giant slab of schist, which is a type of metamorphic rock that's been there since before the dinosaurs. It pushes up through the surface all over the island, especially in the northern reaches where the park was being built. Some of these outcroppings were the size of houses, and they were in the way. The engineers identified the ones that had to go. They marked them with paint, and then the blasting crews moved in. Blasting powder, black powder, whatever you want to call it. The workers drilled holes into the rock by hand, using star drills and sledgehammers. Hours of work to make a single hole. Then they packed the holes with powder, set fuses, cleared the area and lit them. The explosions echoed across the city. People miles away could hear them. Boom, 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 all day long for years. Patrick wasn't on the blasting crews. Thank God. Those men earned more money, but they also died more often. A fuse that burned too fast. A charge that didn't go off and then did when someone got too close. Rocks flying through the air like cannonballs. The workers who died in the blasting accidents didn't get monuments. Their names weren't recorded in the official histories. They were just gone. Replaced the next day by another desperate man who needed the work. Patrick's job was moving what the blasters left behind. The rubble, the boulders, the tons and tons of shattered rock that had to be cleared before anything else could happen. They used horse carts, hundreds of them, lines of carts stretching across the site like ants marching to and from a hill. Men loaded the rocks by hand, lifted them into the carts, drove the carts to wherever the rock was needed. Sometimes it went into the foundations of bridges. Sometimes it was crushed for gravel. Sometimes it was just dumped outside the park boundaries. The foreman kept count. In the first year alone, workers moved almost 300,000 cubic yards of earth and rock. Picture that. 300,000 cubic yards. That's enough to fill a football stadium. And they did it with shovels and pickaxes and their own two hands. The pay was $1 a day. Sometimes $1.25 if you had a specialised skill. That was decent money for unskilled labour in the 1850s, but it wasn't generous, and the work was brutal. Patrick started at dawn, walked from his boarding house in the Points, down near where City Hall is now, all the way up to the park site. That's 3 miles, give or take. He couldn't afford the horse cars. He worked until dark. 10 hours in winter when the sun set early, 14 hours in summer when the light lasted. No breaks except for a quick lunch, no days off except Sunday, and even that wasn't guaranteed during the busy seasons. In summer, the heat was suffocating. The sun beat down on the exposed rock and dirt, turning the site into a furnace. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion. The water barrels ran dry. Dust coated everything, got into your eyes, your lungs, your food. In winter, the cold was worse. Patrick's hands cracked and bled from the frozen tools. His boots, worn thin from months of use, let in the snow. Men got frostbite. Some of them lost fingers, and the work never stopped. Olmsted wanted the park finished. The commissioners were impatient. The newspapers kept asking when New Yorkers would finally get to enjoy their great public space. So the men kept digging, kept blasting, kept hauling. After the clearing came the reshaping. See, Olmsted and Vogt's plan didn't just accept the land as it was, they wanted to sculpt it, move hills, fill valleys, create the illusion of a natural landscape that was anything but natural. Where the plans showed a lake, there was usually a swamp. The workers had to drain the swamps first, digging channels to carry the water away. Then they dug out the basins, shaping the bottoms, lining them with clay to hold the water that would eventually fill them. Where the plans showed a meadow, there was usually rock. The workers blasted and hauled until the ground was level enough to hold soil. Then they brought in the soil, thousands of cartloads of it, hauled from farms in New Jersey and Long Island because Manhattan's native dirt was too poor to grow grass. Where the plans showed a hill, there was sometimes a hollow. The workers filled it in, layer by layer, packing down the earth until it could support whatever was going on top. They were building a landscape from scratch, inventing nature through sheer force of labour. Patrick worked on the lake, the big one in the middle of the park that Olmsted had imagined as the centrepiece of the whole design. For months Patrick shoveled muck out of the swamp, loaded it onto carts, watched it hauled away. His boots rotted from the constant moisture. His back never stopped aching. But slowly, impossibly, the swamp became a basin. The basin filled with water piped in from the new Croton aqueduct. And one day, Patrick stood on the shore of an actual lake in the middle of Manhattan and couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. He'd helped make that. Him and 1,000 other men whose names nobody bothered to write down. The planting came next. This was the part that really staggered the imagination. Olmsted wanted the park to feel like a forest, even though there was almost nothing growing there when construction started. So he ordered trees, lots of trees, more trees than anyone had ever planted in one place in America. Over the course of construction, workers planted more than 270,000 trees and shrubs. Let that number sink in for a second. 270,000. That's not a typo. Elms for the mall, oaks for the meadows, willows for the lake shores, maples and beeches and birches and pines, flowering shrubs for colour, ground cover to hold the soil in place. Each tree had to be dug up somewhere else, transported to the park, and replanted in exactly the right spot according to Olmsted's plans. Each one needed a hole dug for it, water to help it take root, stakes to keep it upright until it was established. Patrick planted trees for 6 months in 1860. His hands were constantly muddy. His knees were shot from kneeling. But there was something different about this work. Something that felt less like destruction and more like creation. He was putting living things into the ground. Things that would grow. Things that would still be there long after he was gone. Some of those trees are still there today, 160 years later. If you walk through Central Park and see a massive elm or oak that looks like it's been there forever, there's a chance that Patrick or someone like Patrick put it in the ground with his own 2 hands. The workers came from everywhere, mostly Irish, like Patrick. The famine had driven so many of them to America that by the 1850s, a quarter of New York City's population was Irish-born. They took the jobs nobody else wanted, dug the ditches, built the roads, laid the railroad tracks, and now built the park. But there were Germans too, skilled craftsmen, many of them, stonemasons who carved the bridges and terraces, metal workers who forged the ornamental railings. They'd fled Europe after the failed revolutions of 1848, looking for a place where they could work without being arrested for their politics. And there were native-born Americans, labourers from the countryside who'd come to the city looking for work, black Americans who'd been free their whole lives or had escaped slavery in the South. All of them mixed together on the work crews, divided by ethnicity and skill, united by the need for a paycheck. The commissioners kept records of how much was spent, how many cubic yards were moved, How many trees were planted? They did not keep records of how many workers were injured or killed. Those numbers apparently weren't important enough to write down. We know some men died in blasting accidents. How many? Nobody bothered to count. We know some fell from scaffolding while building the bridges and terraces. We know some got crushed by falling rocks or runaway horse carts. We know some probably died from diseases that spread through the cramped work camps. Their families got nothing, no compensation, no recognition, just another body to bury and another man looking for work the next morning. Patrick survived. He was still good at that. By 1860, parts of the park were opening to the public even as construction continued elsewhere. People streamed in to see what all the fuss was about. Ladies in fine dresses, gentlemen in top hats, working families who'd walked up from downtown for a Sunday outing. They walked on the paths that Patrick had helped lay. They rested under trees that Patrick had helped plant. They gazed across the lake that Patrick had helped dig. None of them knew his name. None of them thought about the thousands of men who'd spent years turning a wasteland into this. They just saw the beauty, which honestly is probably what Olmsted wanted. The whole point was to make it look natural, like it had always been there. Patrick watched them sometimes, during his lunch breaks. The fancy people in their fancy clothes, enjoying the park like it had grown out of the ground by magic. Part of him resented it. Part of him was proud. He'd helped make something beautiful, something that would last. In a life that had been full of loss and struggle, that meant something. Your blanket's probably feeling heavier now, in a good way. That warm weight settling over you, pressing you gently into the mattress. Patrick would have killed for a blanket like that, for a bed that didn't have 3 other men in it, for a room that didn't smell like cabbage and sweat and desperation. But he kept working, through the freezing winters and the sweltering summers, through the blisters and the aching muscles and the bone-deep exhaustion, through all of it. By 1861, about half the park was finished. Visitors could walk the southern sections, row boats on the lake, stroll down the mall beneath the young elm trees. It was already being called the most beautiful public space in America. And then the Civil War started. Everything changed after that. The workers scattered, some enlisted, some went looking for better paying war work. The construction budgets got slashed as the government focused on fighting the South. Olmsted himself left, resigned his position to run the United States Sanitary Commission, organizing medical care for wounded soldiers. The park he'd dreamed of was half finished, and he was walking away. But the park didn't die. It couldn't. Too much had already been built. Too many trees had been planted. Too many lakes had been dug. The work continued, slower now, with fewer workers and less money. Vaux stayed on, doing what he could. The commissioners argued and schemed and made compromises that Olmsted would have hated. Patrick. We don't know what happened to him. Maybe he enlisted. Maybe he kept working on the park until the war ended. Maybe he moved west, looking for new opportunities in a country that was tearing itself apart. His name isn't in any of the records. None of their names are. The men who actually built Central Park are ghosts. We know they existed because the park exists, but their individual stories are lost. All we have is what they left behind. The paths, the lakes, the meadows, the trees, and the knowledge that none of it came easy, that every inch of Central Park was paid for in sweat and blood, and years of brutal labour by men the city barely acknowledged. That's the real foundation of the park, not the schist bedrock underneath, the workers, the immigrants, the nameless thousands who turned a dream into reality. The war would change everything, for the park, for the city, for the country. But what the workers had built would survive. It always does. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday in April 1861. Fort Sumter had fallen. The Confederates had fired on the American flag. The country was splitting in two. Frederick Law Olmsted read the news in his office at Central Park, surrounded by blueprints and planting schedules and the endless paperwork of building a landscape from scratch. Outside his window, workers were still digging, still blasting, still hauling rock. The park was half finished. His vision was half realized. And now there was a war. Olmsted couldn't fight. A carriage accident the previous summer had mangled his leg so badly that he walked with a permanent limp. He couldn't march. He couldn't charge. He couldn't do any of the heroic things young men were lining up to do, but he could organize. Within weeks, a minister named Henry Whitney Bellows came to him with a proposition. The Union Army was a mess. Thousands of young men were enlisting, flooding into training camps with no idea how to stay healthy, how to avoid disease, how to survive the non-combat parts of war that killed as many soldiers as bullets did. Bellows wanted to create something called the United States Sanitary Commission, a civilian organization to inspect camps, improve hygiene, distribute supplies, and basically keep the army from dying of dysentery before it could die of enemy fire. Would Olmsted run it? It meant leaving Central Park, leaving the project he'd spent 4 years building, leaving Calvert Vaux to manage alone, walking away from meadows and lakes that existed only in his imagination and on paper. Olmsted said yes. In June 1861 he took a leave of absence and headed to Washington. He expected to be gone for a few months, maybe until Christmas. Surely the war would be over by then. Everyone said it would be a quick fight. Everyone was wrong. The Battle of Bull Run happened in July. The Union Army, made up mostly of untrained volunteers who'd signed up thinking war was some kind of adventure, got absolutely routed. Soldiers fled back to Washington in chaos. Congressmen and society ladies who'd actually packed picnic baskets to watch the battle from nearby hills suddenly found themselves running for their lives alongside the retreating troops. The wounded were left on the battlefield because nobody had organized a way to collect them. No ambulance system, no field hospitals ready to receive casualties. Men lay in the Virginia dirt, bleeding and crying for water, while the army that was supposed to protect them ran away. Olmsted got there as fast as he could. What he saw changed him. Soldiers dying not from bullets, but from exhaustion and dehydration. Men who'd marched for hours in summer heat without adequate food or water. An army that had collapsed not because it was outfought, but because nobody had thought about logistics. He wrote a report called The Demoralization of the Volunteers that was so damning, so brutal in its assessment of army incompetence that the Sanitary Commission decided not to publish it. Too embarrassing, too likely to destroy what little morale remained. The army brass didn't want civilians telling them how badly they'd failed. But privately, Olmsted got to work. He organized supply depots. He hired inspectors to visit camps and report on conditions. He fought with the Army Medical Bureau, which resented civilian interference. He pushed for reforms that the military brass didn't want. Sound familiar? It was Central Park all over again. Olmsted versus the bureaucrats. Vision versus politics. The right way to do things versus the way things had always been done. Back in New York, the park stumbled along without him. Vaux did what he could. He defended their original design against commissioners who wanted to make changes. He blocked a set of elaborate entrance gates that would have ruined the natural feeling of the park. He kept planting trees and shaping landscapes according to plans he and Olmsted had drawn together. But Vaux was an architect, not an administrator. The organisational side of things, the budgets and the schedules and the management of thousands of workers, that had been Olmsted's domain. Without him, things slowed down. Momentum was lost. The war kept dragging on, not months, years. The quick victory everyone had promised turned into a grinding nightmare that consumed the entire country. Olmsted threw himself into sanitary commission work with the same obsessive energy he'd brought to everything else in his life. He travelled to battlefields, he organised hospital ships, he argued with generals and fought with bureaucrats and pushed himself past every reasonable limit. During the Peninsular Campaign of 1862, when the Union Army tried to capture Richmond by advancing up the Virginia Peninsula, Olmsted personally supervised the evacuation of thousands of wounded soldiers, 8,000 to 10,000 by some estimates, ferried away from the fighting on boats he'd requisitioned and staffed with volunteer nurses and doctors. The commission used a sidewheel steamboat called the Wilson Small as a floating headquarters. Olmsted was on board for weeks at a time, coordinating the movement of men and supplies while the guns thundered in the distance. He saw things no park designer should ever have to see. Men with their legs blown off, men dying of infections that simple cleanliness could have prevented, men rotting in field hospitals while supplies sat unused in warehouses because nobody had figured out how to distribute them, young soldiers calling for their mothers in the dark, knowing nobody was coming. It broke something in him. Or maybe it just confirmed what he already knew about human institutions. They failed. They always failed, unless someone forced them not to. By 1863, Olmsted was exhausted, physically wrecked, emotionally drained, fighting with his own executive committee, who thought he was spending too much money, fighting with the army, who thought he was overstepping. In September, he resigned from the Sanitary Commission and headed west, California, a gold mining operation in the Sierra Nevada foothills. Good money, fresh start, as far from Central Park and the war and everything else as he could get. He didn't know if he'd ever come back. Let's pause for a second. Feel the weight of your body on the mattress, the warmth of your blankets, the quiet of wherever you're lying right now. Olmsted didn't have any of that during those years. He had chaos and death and the constant pressure of trying to fix things that couldn't be fixed. He had sleepless nights and impossible decisions, and the knowledge that whatever he did, people were still going to die. And back in New York, his park was slipping away from him. While Olmsted was gone, politics happened. The Civil War was expensive. The city needed money. And men in power started looking at Central Park as a source of jobs and contracts and all the things that made political machines run. Tammany Hall was watching. You need to understand something about Tammany Hall. It wasn't a building. Well, it was a building, but that's not the point. It was a political organization, the Democratic Party machine that controlled New York City. And by the 1860s, the man who controlled Tammany Hall was William McGeer Tweed. Boss Tweed. Picture him. 300 pounds of ambition and appetite, a diamond stick pin the size of a baby's fist, a smile that promised everything and meant nothing. He'd started as a volunteer firefighter, worked his way up through city politics, and now he had his hands on everything that mattered in New York. Tweed didn't care about parks, he cared about money, and Central Park represented a lot of money. Construction contracts, maintenance contracts, jobs that could be given to loyal voters, supplies that could be purchased from friendly vendors at inflated prices. For most of the 1860s, the park was protected by state-appointed commissioners who kept Tammany at arm's length. Andrew Haswell Green, the comptroller, was a stickler for budgets and proper procedures. He drove Olmsted crazy with his penny pinching, but he also kept the books clean. Then, in 1870, everything changed. Tweed pushed a new city charter through the state legislature. Bribed his way through, actually. $600,000 in cash to get the votes he needed. The new charter transferred control of the parks from state-appointed commissioners to city officials that Tweed controlled. Within months, the entire Central Park Commission was swept away. Green was fired. Olmsted and Vaux, who had returned to New York in 1865 and been working on the park again, were pushed out. A new Department of Public Parks was created. And who do you think ran it? Peter Sweeney, one of Tweed's closest allies, part of what newspapers would later call the Tweed Ring. The ring operated on a simple principle. Every bill that the city paid got padded, 85% markup standard. If a contractor did $10,000 worth of work, he billed the city for $50,000. The extra $40,000 got split between the ring members. Fake leases, false vouchers, payments to companies that didn't exist, supplies purchased at 10 times their actual value, checks written to people who had never been born and would never exist. The bookkeeping was almost comically brazen. The ring didn't even bother to hide what they were doing. They just assumed that nobody would ever look closely enough to notice. And for a while, they were right. The most famous example was the New York County Courthouse, a building that should have cost maybe $500,000. By the time the ring was done with it, the city had paid $13 million. One bill alone was for nearly $300,000 worth of thermometers. Another charged the city over $1 million for furniture and carpets. Tweed and his friends pocketed the difference, dividing up the spoils like pirates splitting treasure. Central Park got the same treatment. Maintenance contracts went to ring-connected companies. Unnecessary repairs were ordered and billed at inflated rates. Jobs were handed out to Tammany loyalists regardless of whether they knew anything about parks or trees or landscaping. Men were paid to not work. Supplies were delivered to warehouses and then sold out the back door. The subtle balance that Olmsted and Vaux had created, that careful harmony of meadow and woodland and water, started to fray. Roads were widened without regard for the original design. Buildings were added that clashed with the natural scenery. The vision was being chipped away, piece by piece. Olmsted watched from the sidelines, powerless. He and Vaux wrote letters. They complained to anyone who would listen. But the ring controlled everything. The mayor, the comptroller, the judges, the police. What could two landscape architects do against that kind of power? Nothing. They could do nothing. The corruption might have continued indefinitely if not for two things. The New York Times, which started publishing evidence of the ring's thefts in 1871, and a political cartoonist named Thomas Nast, who drew pictures of Tweed and his cronies as vultures and thieves in Harper's Weekly. Tweed famously offered Nast $500,000 to stop drawing those cartoons. Nast refused, and the pictures kept coming, week after week, showing the boss as a bloated symbol of corruption. The thing about cartoons is that you don't need to read them. The illiterate immigrants who voted for Tammany candidates could understand a picture even if they couldn't understand an article, and the pictures were devastating. In October 1871, the ring collapsed. Tweed was arrested. The other members fled or turned on each other. Andrew Haswell Green was brought back as comptroller to sort out the financial disaster, and Olmsted and Vaux were rehired. They came back to a park that had been damaged but not destroyed. The bones of their design were still there. The lakes, the meadows, the winding paths. But the details had been corrupted. Cheap materials substituted for good ones. Plantings neglected. The 1,000 small touches that made the park feel natural rather than artificial. Many of them were gone. They tried to fix what they could. But the Ring years had left scars, and the political battles weren't over. They'd never be over. As long as there was money in the parks, there would be people trying to get their hands on it. Tweed himself went to prison in 1873, escaped briefly, was recaptured, died in jail in 1878, alone and broken. But Tammany Hall survived him. The machine kept running. Different bosses, same basic approach. The park would always be a target. Olmsted understood this by now. He'd spent 15 years fighting for Central Park, and he was tired, exhausted in ways that went beyond physical fatigue. The constant battles, the endless compromises, the knowledge that whatever he built, someone would try to tear down or corrupt or simply neglect. In 1873, Central Park was officially declared complete. Stretching from 59th Street to 110th Street, 840 acres of manufactured wilderness in the heart of Manhattan. More than 270,000 trees and shrubs planted. Miles of winding paths and carriage drives. Lakes that looked ancient even though they had been dug by hand less than 15 years before. The final cost was nearly $14 million. More than double the original estimate, partly because of the Ring's corruption, partly because nobody had really understood how massive the project would be, partly because war and politics and human greed had added costs that no engineer could have predicted. Tens of thousands of New Yorkers poured through the gates to see what their city had created. They walked the mall beneath the young elm trees, trees that Patrick and men like Patrick had planted one by one. They rowed boats across the lake that workers had dug out of swampland with shovels and horse carts. They rode horses through the winding drives that Olmsted had designed to hide the city from view. The newspapers called it the lungs of the city, a place where the urban masses could breathe clean air and rest their weary souls. For one moment, the city's divisions seemed to fade. Rich and poor walked the same paths. Immigrants and old-stock Americans shared the same shade. Irish workers and German craftsmen and the children of the families who'd once lived in Seneca Village, they all had a right to be there. The democratic dream that Olmsted had believed in, the idea that beauty should belong to everyone, it was actually happening. But beneath the celebration, Olmsted knew the truth. The park would always need defenders. It would always be under threat, not just from corruption, but from neglect, from changing tastes, from the simple passage of time. Parks weren't like buildings. You couldn't just finish them and walk away. They are living things, and living things required constant care. He and Vaux had created something beautiful, but keeping it beautiful would require vigilance, forever. Your eyes might be getting heavy now. That's okay. Let them close if they want to. Olmsted's eyes were heavy too by the end of 1873. He was 51 years old. He'd spent the last 16 years building Central Park, running the Sanitary Commission, managing a gold mine in California, and fighting battles he never should have had to fight. His leg still hurt from that carriage accident. His nerves were shot. His family had suffered through years of uncertainty and upheaval. And for what? A park that politicians could corrupt and bureaucrats could neglect and time could slowly erode. He submitted his final report to the park commissioners. Then he turned to other projects: Brooklyn's Prospect Park, Buffalo's park system, the grounds of the United States Capitol. The park he'd created would have to survive without him. Whether it could was another question entirely. Thomas walked the park at dawn when most of New York was still sleeping. He'd been a park keeper since 1870, hired during the Tweed years when jobs went to anyone who knew somebody. Thomas knew somebody. His cousin worked for a Tammany ward boss, and that was enough to get him a badge and a uniform and $1.50 a day. But here's the thing about Thomas. He actually cared. Most of the political hires showed up, collected their pay, and did as little as possible. Not Thomas. Something about the park got under his skin. The way the morning light hit the lake, the quiet paths before the crowds arrived, the trees that somebody, years ago, had planted one by one. He didn't know their names then. Olmsted and Vaux. He'd heard them mentioned, but they were just two more people who'd come and gone. Politicians, commissioners, superintendents, they all came and went. The park remained. By 1874, Thomas could feel something shifting. The park was changing, not in any single dramatic way, but slowly, piece by piece. The grass grew taller than it should have. Paths developed cracks that nobody repaired. Benches broke and stayed broken. The careful balance that had made the park feel natural, like some kind of wilderness that happened to exist in the middle of a city, it was slipping away. Thomas understood why. Money. There was never enough of it anymore. The panic of 1873 had wrecked everything. Banks collapsed. Businesses failed. Thousands of men lost their jobs overnight. The newspapers called it the worst economic crisis since the nation's founding, which was probably true. Suddenly the city didn't have money for basic services, let alone park maintenance. Budget cuts hit the parks department hard. Workers were laid off. Supplies were cut. The army of gardeners and groundskeepers who'd maintained Olmsted and Vaux's vision, most of them were gone by 74. Thomas survived because he was cheap and he was willing to do the work of 3 men. Walk the paths, chase off vandals, report damage, somehow keep the whole thing from falling apart. He wasn't alone. There were maybe 24 park keepers left by the mid-70s, scattered across 800 acres. Not nearly enough, but they did what they could. That's the thing nobody remembers about the decline years. It could have been so much worse. The park could have been completely destroyed, turned back into the rocky wasteland it had been before the workers came. But a handful of ordinary men like Thomas, kept it alive through sheer stubbornness. They patched the paths with whatever materials they could scrounge. They watered the young trees during droughts, hauling buckets when the irrigation systems failed. They chased away the gangs of boys who came to vandalize and the squatters who tried to set up camp in the more remote areas. It wasn't glamorous work. Nobody wrote newspaper articles about it. But it mattered. Meanwhile, the world around the park was changing in ways that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. Fifth Avenue, along the park's eastern edge, was transforming into a canyon of wealth. The mansions started going up in the 70s and kept coming through the 80s. Stone facades imported from Europe. Iron gates forged by master craftsmen. Doormen in livery standing guard at massive oak doors. The Vanderbilts, the Astors, the Carnegies. Families whose net worth could have funded the entire parks department for decades. For centuries, probably. They treated Central Park as their private garden. Their carriages rolled through the drives on Sunday afternoons, polished and gleaming, driven by coachmen in matching uniforms. Ladies in silk dresses promenaded along the mall, parasols shading their faces from the sun. Gentlemen in top hats discussed business deals and stock prices while their children ran ahead, supervised by nannies in starched white aprons. From certain angles you might think nothing was wrong at all. The wealthy parts of the park looked fine. The paths where the rich walked were swept clean. The views from Fifth Avenue were carefully maintained. It was the other parts that showed the rot. The northern reaches, where fewer wealthy visitors ventured. The remote corners of the Ramble. The working-class entrances on the west side where the paths were cracked and the benches were broken. Thomas walked them all. He saw both worlds. The glittering Sunday promenades and the neglected edges where nobody cared what happened. He touched his cap when the wealthy noticed him, which wasn't often. He was invisible to them, part of the scenery, like the trees and the benches and the lampposts, something that was just supposed to be there, maintained by forces they didn't think about. But he also watched other people come to the park, working families from downtown who walk for miles because they couldn't afford the horse-car fare. 5 cents might not sound like much, but when you're making $1 a day and feeding 4 children, 5 cents is dinner. So they walked. 3 miles, 4 miles, whatever it took. Immigrant children who'd never seen grass before. Not real grass, not like this. Kids from the tenements of the Lower East Side where the only green things were the mould on the walls and the occasional wilted cabbage in a pushcart. They came to Central Park and ran like wild things, drunk on space and fresh air. Old men who sat on the broken benches and stared at the lake, grateful for a few hours of peace. Men who'd worked in factories their whole lives, their hearing half gone from the machines, their lungs damaged from the dust. The park was the only quiet place they knew, the only place where the noise stopped. Women who brought their sewing and sat in the shade watching their children play. Women who worked 16-hour days in garment shops, hunched over machines until their backs ached. On Sundays, the park was their only escape. The park belonged to all of them. That was the idea anyway. Rich and poor, native and immigrant, everyone welcome. The democratic dream that Olmsted had written about so passionately. In practice, it wasn't quite that simple. The wealthy controlled the best hours, the best paths, the best views. They had rules written to favour their kind of recreation, their kind of behaviour. Quiet strolls, carriage rides, contemplative appreciation of nature. The working class got what was left. Early mornings before work, late evenings after, Sundays when the factories closed and the mansions had their afternoon promenades. But they came, despite everything, despite the cracked paths and the broken benches and the invisible barriers, they kept coming. Because the park was theirs too. Because Olmsted had built it for them, even if nobody remembered that anymore. 1874 brought trouble of a different kind. The economic collapse had left tens of thousands of New Yorkers unemployed. Men who'd worked their whole lives suddenly had nothing, no jobs, no prospects, no way to feed their families, and they were angry. In January, a group called the Committee of Safety organized a rally at Tompkins Square, demanding that the city provide jobs or relief. The police showed up with clubs. What happened next was ugly. Officers charged into the crowd, beating anyone they could reach. Men, women, children. Didn't matter. The newspapers called it a riot, but it was more like a massacre. The protests spread. Throughout that winter and into the spring, demonstrations erupted across the city. Some of them came to Central Park. The park that was built for all people became a battleground between the desperate and the authorities. Thomas watched it happen, stood at the edge of crowds, his keeper's badge hidden in his pocket, not sure whose side he was supposed to be on. The poor had legitimate grievances, but violence wasn't going to solve anything, and the park was caught in the middle. Afterward, when the protests faded and the newspapers moved on to other stories, the park looked different. Trampled grass, broken branches. The damage wasn't severe, but it felt symbolic. The refuge that was supposed to heal the city's divisions had become a stage for those divisions. Through it all, the budget kept shrinking. By 1879, maintenance spending hit rock bottom. There was barely enough money to keep the paths clear and the gates open. Thomas's rounds got longer and lonelier. Fewer keepers meant more ground to cover. Some mornings he walked for hours without seeing another uniformed man. Just him and the park and the slow decay. The trees that Olmsted had planted so carefully were dying without proper care. Some from disease, some from drought. Some just gave up, overwhelmed by the pollution that was getting worse every year as the city grew. Roads cracked and weren't repaired. Bridges rusted. The carefully designed drainage system, which had transformed swamps into lakes, started failing in places, creating muddy patches where manicured lawns used to be. Political appointees replaced the skilled caretakers who'd understood how the park was supposed to work. Men who'd never planted a seed in their lives were suddenly in charge of gardens. Men who couldn't tell an elm from an oak were making decisions about which trees to save and which to cut. Calvert Vaux, still living in New York, watched it happen with growing despair. He wrote letters. He complained to anyone who would listen. In one letter from this period, he said the park was losing its soul. Thomas never met Vaux, but he would have understood exactly what he meant. Then, in 1877, something unexpected happened. Reform-minded city officials, embarrassed by how far the park had fallen, invited Frederick, Law Olmsted, back as a consultant, unpaid, which tells you something about the budget situation. But they wanted his eyes on the park, his assessment, his recommendations for what could be saved. Olmsted came back, an older man now, walking with that same limp from the carriage accident, his health failing after years of overwork. He walked the paths he'd designed 2 decades earlier. What he found broke his heart. Roads widened without regard for the original plan. Buildings added that clashed with the natural scenery. Cheap materials substituted where good ones had rotted away. The 1,000 small touches that had made Central Park feel like a real landscape, not just a collection of trees and paths. So many of them were gone. He wrote reports, sharp but calm the way he always wrote. He pointed out what had been damaged and why it mattered. The roads that had been widened destroyed sight lines he'd spent months perfecting. The buildings that had been added blocked views that were supposed to carry your eye across meadows to distant tree lines. The cheap repairs were already failing and would need to be redone properly or not at all. He warned that a public work of art, if left unguarded, decays in both body and purpose. That wasn't just about broken paths and dying trees. It was about the idea of the park itself, the democratic dream, the belief that beauty should belong to everyone. Some of his recommendations were followed. Most weren't. The money simply wasn't there. But his return reminded people what Central Park was supposed to be, what it could still become if anyone cared enough to save it. The commissioners who'd invited him back were genuinely concerned. They published his reports. They used his words to argue for increased funding. They weren't bad men. They just didn't have the resources or the political power to fix everything that had gone wrong. Thomas heard about Olmsted's visit through the gossip that filtered down to the keepers. He didn't meet the man. Olmsted walked with commissioners, not with $50 a day employees. But Thomas felt something shift after that. a sense that maybe the decline wasn't permanent. Maybe the park had a future after all. Maybe somebody important still cared. The 1880s brought slow, tentative improvement. Citizens' groups started organising. Wealthy New Yorkers who loved the park and hated what it was becoming formed committees with impressive names. The Parks Protective Association, the Municipal Art Society. They raised private funds, lobbied City Hall, published pamphlets explaining why Central Park mattered, not just as a pretty place, but as essential infrastructure for a growing city. The newspapers ran editorials demanding better maintenance, and for once, the politicians listened. Not because they suddenly cared about trees and meadows, because wealthy voters cared, and wealthy voters controlled campaign contributions, and campaign contributions won elections. Gardeners were rehired. Not as many as before, but enough to make a difference. Lawns were reseeded where bare patches had appeared. Dead trees were replaced with new saplings. For the first time in years, new plantings appeared in garden beds that had been empty and neglected. The drainage systems were repaired in critical areas. Paths were repaved, at least the important ones. Bridges got fresh coats of paint over the rust. The Metropolitan Museum of Art opened on the park's eastern edge in 1880, bringing a new wave of visitors. People who came for the paintings and sculptures discovered the park itself, wandering out onto the paths after their museum visits, rediscovering a treasure they'd forgotten. Rowboats returned to the lake. Bands played music on Sundays. Children ran across the great lawn, their laughter carrying across meadows that were actually green again. Thomas watched the recovery happen. He was older now, his hair going grey, his joints aching from years of walking those 800 acres. But he was still there, still making his rounds, still caring about a park that most people took for granted. By the late 80s, Central Park was stabilising, not restored to its original glory, not by a long shot. Too much had been lost. Too many decisions had been made by people who didn't understand what they were doing. But the bleeding had stopped. The park was going to survive. Olmsted was gone by then, working on other projects. Boston's park system, the grounds of Stanford University, the landscape for the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. His health was getting worse. His memory was starting to fade. He wouldn't work much longer. Vaux was still in New York, still fighting quietly for the park he'd helped create. He designed small restorations when the city would pay for them. He worked on Riverside Park and Morningside Park, trying to bring some of Central Park's spirit to other neighbourhoods. But tastes were changing. The idea of a passive, contemplative park where you walked quietly and let nature restore your spirit, that seemed old-fashioned to the new generation. They wanted activity, sports, entertainment, tennis courts and baseball diamonds and playgrounds with swings and slides. The debate that would define the park's future was just beginning. Should Central Park remain a rural refuge in the heart of the city, or should it evolve into something more modern, more active, more fun? Nobody had the answer yet. Maybe there wasn't one answer. Maybe the park would have to be both things at once. Thomas retired in 1892. 22 years of walking those paths. 22 years of watching seasons change, watching the park rise and fall and rise again. On his last day, he walked the full circuit one more time, dawn to dusk, every path he knew by heart, the lake where he'd chased away skinny dippers on hot summer nights, the ramble where he'd found lost children and returned them to frantic parents, the mall where he'd stood at the edge of concerts, listening to music he didn't have the money or the education to fully appreciate, He wasn't a famous man. His name never appeared in the newspapers. No statue would be erected in his honour, but he'd kept the park alive during its darkest years, him and a handful of others like him, the keepers, the forgotten men who did the unglamorous work while the designers and politicians got the credit. You're probably getting sleepy now. That's good. Let yourself drift. Thomas would have understood that feeling. The bone-deep exhaustion after a long day of walking, the satisfaction of having done something worthwhile, even if nobody noticed. He died in 1904, a few months after Olmsted himself passed away. The newspapers didn't mention Thomas. Why would they? He was just a park keeper. But the park he'd helped protect was still there, still green, still welcoming millions of visitors every year. That was his monument. This same monument that Patrick had built with his hands and Olmsted had built with his vision. Central Park, alive, enduring, waiting for the next chapter of its story. Frederick Law Olmsted never stopped working, even after Central Park nearly broke him, even after Tweed's corruption, the endless political battles, the years of watching his creation get chipped away piece by piece. In 1883 he packed up and moved to Brookline, Massachusetts, bought a farmhouse on nearly 2 acres of hilly land, called it Fairstead. He was 61 years old, famous now, the father of American landscape architecture. But fame didn't slow him down. If anything, it just brought more work. His office expanded into the farmhouse, spilling into a 2-story addition. His sons John Charles and Frederick Jr. joined the practice. They drew plans on massive tables, rolling out sheets of paper covered in topographic lines and plant specifications. The commissions kept coming. Boston's Emerald Necklace, a chain of parks and green spaces threading through the city. The grounds of Stanford University in California. The Biltmore Estate in North Carolina, where George Vanderbilt wanted 250 acres of formal gardens and wild forest. Olmsted took them all. His body was breaking down. His leg, the one he'd injured in that carriage accident back in '61, ached constantly. His eyes were failing. Sleep came harder every year. But he kept working, 20-hour days sometimes, sprints of intense labour followed by collapses into exhaustion, his mind racing even when his body screamed for rest. Your bed, by the way, is doing the opposite right now, cradling you, supporting you. No deadlines, no plans to draw, no politicians to fight, just rest. Olmsted couldn't seem to find that, maybe didn't know how to look for it anymore. In 1890, the biggest commission of his life arrived. Chicago, the World's Columbian Exposition, a massive world's fair celebrating 400 years since Columbus reached the Americas. Chicago had beaten out New York, St. Louis and Washington to host it. They wanted to show up Paris, which had just unveiled the Eiffel Tower. Olmsted was nearly 70 years old. His health was failing. His doctors told him to slow down. He said yes anyway. The site was Jackson Park, 630 acres of sandy marshland along Lake Michigan, about as promising as the rocky, swampy ground he'd transformed in Manhattan all those years ago. Olmsted looked at the marsh and saw what he always saw, possibility. He designed a system of lagoons and canals, dredging the swamp to create waterways that would reflect the gleaming white buildings rising around them. In the centre, he carved out a wooded island, a place of quiet green amid all the spectacle. His goal, he wrote, was to create natural scenery that would provide a quieting influence, counteractive to the artificial grandeur and the crowds, pomp, splendour and bustle of the rest of the exposition. Same goal he'd had in Central Park 35 years earlier. Give people a place to breathe. The scale was staggering. His crews collected over 1 million plants from streams and swamps around Chicago, 100,000 willows alone, 75 railroad cars full of water plants, 285,000 ferns, all planted by hand, all arranged to look like nature had simply decided to cooperate with the architects. The fair opened in May of 1893. 27 million people came to see it over 6 months. Half the population of the entire country walked through Olmsted's lagoons, rowed boats along his canals, rested on his wooded island. One farmer was overheard telling his wife as they left, "Well, Susan, it paid, even if it did take all the burial money. People had mortgaged their farms to attend, borrowed against their life insurance, rode trains for days across a country still recovering from economic depression. They came to see the White City." But what Olmsted had really given them was something softer, greener, the curve of water against shore, the rustle of willows in the wind, a moment of peace in the midst of overwhelming spectacle. He was 71 years old, and he'd done it again. Meanwhile, back in New York, the city was transforming in ways Olmsted could barely recognize. Electric lights now glowed along Broadway. The Great White Way, people called it, because the arc lamps burned so bright they turned night into day. Thomas Edison had flipped the switch on Pearl Street Station back in '82, and the city hadn't stopped glowing since. Buildings were growing taller. Steel frames and electric elevators made it possible to reach 10 stories, then 12, then more. By 1899, the Park Row building would top out at 391 feet, the beginning of the skyline that would eventually surround Central Park like a canyon of glass and stone. Electric streetcars hummed down avenues that horses had dominated just years before. Elevated trains rattled overhead, carrying workers from neighborhoods that hadn't existed when Olmsted first surveyed that rocky ground in 1857. The population had exploded. 3 million people now, ships still bringing immigrants daily, just like they had in Bryant's time. But now they were arriving to a city of electric light and steel towers instead of muddy streets and wooden tenements. And in September of 1899, something happened that would have seemed impossible to the people who'd fought so hard for Central Park. A man named Henry Bliss stepped off a streetcar at West 74th Street and Central Park West. An electric taxi struck him. He became the first recorded automobile fatality in American history. The future had arrived, and it was moving fast. Central Park sat quietly in the middle of all this change, an island of green surrounded by a city that was inventing the modern world. The quiet strolls and carriage rides that once defined the park were giving way to something louder. Young men played baseball on the open fields. Ice skaters crowded the frozen ponds in winter. Thousands gathered for concerts at the mall. People wanted playgrounds now, tennis courts, ball fields. The park's original purpose, that quiet communion with nature that Olmsted had designed so carefully, was evolving into something more active, more social, different from what he'd imagined, but maybe just as needed. Olmsted watched from Massachusetts. His health declined through the 90s, memory slipping, focus harder to maintain. The sprints of manic energy followed by longer and longer periods of confusion. His sons took over more of the work. The firm continued, but Olmsted's hand grew shakier on the drafting table. In 1895, senility forced him to retire. His worst fear was coming true. His father had been a director of an insane asylum. Olmsted had always dreaded ending up in such a place. Losing his mind, losing control, becoming one of those patients he'd designed grounds for, because that's what he'd done. Among all his parks and estates and fairgrounds, Olmsted had designed the landscapes of mental institutions, the Buffalo State Hospital, McLean Hospital in Massachusetts. He believed nature could heal the troubled mind, designed those grounds with the same care he'd given Central Park, paths for walking, views to rest the eyes, open spaces where patients could find peace. Now he would need that peace himself, but first, Calvert Vaux. They hadn't worked together in years. Their partnership had ended officially back in 1872. They'd collaborated on projects since then, fought over credit and fees and whose vision should prevail. Their relationship was complicated. Two brilliant men who had created something neither could have built alone. In November of 1895, Vaux was 70 years old, living in Manhattan mostly, but staying with his son Downing in Brooklyn, a neighborhood called Bath Beach, out near Gravesend Bay. He was officially retired, though he still held an honorary position as the Parks Department's landscape advisor, still thinking about parks, still walking as he always had, taking long morning strolls along the waterfront. November 19th was a foggy day. Vaux left his son's house that morning, left behind his gold watch and chain, his vest, had about $2 in change in his pocket. He walked toward the water. At some point during the day, a Captain Ditmar spotted him on a pier near the bay. They talked briefly. Vaux said he was admiring the improvements they'd made to the area, talked a little about how to make the beach more pleasant for visitors. Then Vaux continued walking the piers, alone. That was the last anyone saw him alive. When evening came and he hadn't returned, his son and daughters grew worried. They searched the hotels, the hospitals, even sent word to the keepers at Prospect Park, another masterpiece Vaux had helped design with Olmsted. No sign of him. 2 days later, a workman on a coal dock spotted something in the rough water of Gravesend Bay, a body being tossed about in the waves. It disappeared before he could reach it, then drifted back alongside the bulkhead. They pulled him from the water with a boat hook. Vaux's son came to identify the body. He could barely bring himself to look at his father's face. Recognized the well-worn suit first, then looked away. There was a bruise on the head, a slight cut over the eye. His hat, spectacles, and left shoe were missing. The newspapers speculated. Some mentioned suicide. His career had slowed. His style had fallen out of fashion. The classical designs coming back into vogue didn't match his preference for naturalistic curving forms. But his son refused to accept that explanation. Murder wasn't even considered. The death was ruled accidental. A 70-year-old man, unfamiliar with the area, walking on foggy piers. One misstep, the cold water of Gravesend Bay. Some believed exhaustion and disappointment had weighed on him, that all those years of fighting for parks, watching his vision get compromised and altered and ignored, had simply worn him out. We'll never know for certain. But here's what we do know. Calvert Vaux, the man who had convinced Frederick Law Olmsted to enter that design competition back in 1857, the man who had coined the term landscape architect, the man who had designed Bethesda Terrace and the bridges and the Ramble, and so much of what people love about Central Park, died alone in cold water on a foggy November morning. He was buried in Kingston, New York. Today, there's a park at Gravesend Bay named after him, Calvert Vaux Park. It's not far from where his body was found. Olmsted probably received the news at Fairstead. We don't know what he said. We don't know if he could still fully understand what it meant, given how his mind was deteriorating. But the two men who had dreamed Central Park into existence were now forever separated. One gone, the other fading. 3 more years passed. In 1898, Olmsted's family made the decision they'd been dreading. His dementia had progressed too far. He couldn't care for himself anymore, couldn't recognize people some days, couldn't find peace in his own mind. They committed him to McLean Hospital, the same McLean Hospital whose grounds he had helped design years before. There's a story, and who knows if it's true, that as they wheeled him into the facility he looked around at the landscape and muttered something. They didn't follow my plan, confound them. Even then, even with his mind slipping away, he was still a landscape architect, still noticing what they'd gotten wrong. He spent his final 5 years there, in a cottage on grounds he had shaped for others. Nurses and family members walked with him along the paths. His eyes, once so keen at spotting the curve of a meadow or the angle of a vista, now saw things differently. Sometimes he remembered Central Park. Sometimes he didn't. The man who had transformed swamps into lakes and rocky outcrops into winding paths, who had given millions of people a place to breathe in a suffocating city, who had believed so deeply that nature could heal what the industrial world had broken, spent his last years in an institution for the troubled mind. On August 28th, 1903, Frederick Law Olmsted died at McLean Hospital. He was 81 years old. They buried him in Hartford, Connecticut, the Old North Cemetery, back where he had started, in the city where he was born. The newspapers wrote long obituaries, called him America's greatest landscape architect, listed his achievements: Central Park, Prospect Park, the Emerald Necklace, the World's Fair, Stanford, Biltmore, dozens of parks and campuses and public spaces across the country. Daniel Burnham, who had worked with Olmsted on the Chicago Fair, said it best. He paints with lakes and wooded slopes, with lawns and banks and forest-covered hills, with mountainsides and ocean views. But maybe the more honest tribute was simpler. He gave people places to rest, in cities that were growing too fast, too crowded, too loud, in a world that was electrifying and mechanizing and racing toward a future no one fully understood. He carved out spaces where people could slow down, where they could walk on grass and sit under trees and watch light move across water. He didn't just design parks, he designed relief. Your bed is giving you that same relief right now, that same permission to stop, to breathe, to let your thoughts drift like boats on a quiet lake. Olmsted would have understood that feeling, the need for it, the healing power of simply resting. He spent his whole life trying to give that gift to strangers. And Central Park, the park that had nearly destroyed him, the park that had been taken over by corrupt politicians and altered by short-sighted officials and neglected during years of economic hardship, that park was still there, still green, still welcoming millions of visitors every year, still doing exactly what he and Vaux had designed it to do, providing a counteractive to the effects of the artificial grandeur of the city, a place where tired workers could find a meadow, where children could run on grass, where couples could row boats across water that reflected the sky. Both creators were gone now. Bryant, the poet who had first demanded a park for New York. Downing, the landscape designer who had dreamed of it before he drowned. Vaux, pulled from Cold Bay water with a bruise on his head. Olmsted, fading away in an asylum he'd designed for others. All gone. But what they'd built remained. The elm still arched over the mall, the lake still shimmered in afternoon light, the ramble still tangled with green. Bethesda Fountain still watched over it all. New York had grown around the park like a body around a heart. 3 million people now, more coming every day, the tallest buildings in the world rising along its edges, electric lights, automobiles, subway tunnels being dug beneath the streets. The 20th century was arriving, and Central Park would be there to greet it. Not the same park Olmsted and Vaux had designed in 1858. Changed, adapted, sometimes compromised, but alive, still breathing, still offering what it had always offered. A place for New Yorkers to go when they needed to escape. A place to rest, just like you're resting now, comfortable, safe, letting the story carry you somewhere quiet. The park would face more challenges in the century to come, times of glory and times of decay. But for now, in those early years of the 1900s, it stood as proof of what was possible when a city decided its people deserved beauty. When a poet, a designer, and 2 unlikely partners refused to accept that crowded didn't have to mean suffocating. When workers like Patrick broke rock and planted trees for $1 a day. When keepers like Thomas walked their rounds year after year, protecting something they loved. The story wasn't over, but the men who had started it were at peace now, wherever that peace takes you. The park outlived them all. That's the thing about places. They go on after the people who made them are gone. The trees keep growing, the water keeps reflecting the sky, the paths keep winding through the green. By 1910, Central Park had been there for more than 50 years, half a century of seasons, leaves falling and returning, snow covering the great lawn, then melting into spring, summer crowds and autumn quiet. The city around it had become something none of the founders could have imagined. 4.5 million people now. The population had nearly doubled since Olmsted died. Ships still arriving daily at the harbour, but now they docked at Ellis Island, where immigrants filed through inspection halls before scattering into the city's neighbourhoods. Italians in Little Italy, Jews on the Lower East Side, Greeks and Poles and Russians crowding into tenements that made the old 5 Points look spacious. The city was louder, taller, faster than ever, and in the middle of it all Central Park sat quietly, waiting. The early 1900s brought something new, a movement. People called it the Progressive Era. Reformers who believed cities could be made better, that government could actually help people, that the cramped, disease-ridden neighbourhoods didn't have to stay that way forever. They pushed for public health programs, better housing, schools for immigrant children, and parks. Central Park became part of that conversation. Groups like the Municipal Art Society argued that the park should be preserved not just for beauty, but for democracy. They reminded city leaders of what Olmsted and Vaux had written all those years ago, that the park was meant for everyone, not just the wealthy families in their Fifth Avenue mansions. Everyone. The park had drifted from that purpose during the years of neglect. Tammany appointees had treated it like a source of contract money rather than a public trust. Maintenance had slipped. Features had been altered without thought to the original design. But now people were paying attention again. Samuel Parsons Jr. became the Parks Department's landscape architect. He'd trained under Vaux himself back in the 80s. He knew the original vision. He worked to restore the nurseries, to protect the trees, to block politicians who wanted to fill the park with monuments and structures that didn't belong. He was removed in 1911 after fighting one too many battles, but his work mattered. He'd shown that preservation was possible if someone cared enough to fight for it. Citizens' groups formed. the Parks and Playground Association, the Parks Conservation Association. Names that sounded official, but really just meant ordinary New Yorkers who cared about green space. They organised cleanup campaigns, planted trees where old ones had died, raised money for repairs the city budget couldn't cover. School children joined tree planting days, getting their hands dirty in soil that has been worked by immigrant labourers 60 years before. Neighbourhood associations adopted sections of path to maintain. Women's clubs raised funds for flower beds. It was grassroots preservation, decades before that phrase existed. For the first time in decades, the park wasn't just a political football or a source of contract money. It was becoming what it was always supposed to be: public property, public inheritance. Attendance reached its all-time high in those years. Working-class families who'd never had time for leisure suddenly found a few hours on Sunday afternoons. Children from tenement neighbourhoods saw grass for the first time, really saw it. Not the scraggly patches between buildings, but actual meadows stretching toward trees. Immigrant communities at the park's borders started treating it like their own backyard. Because it was. Italian families spread blankets on the sheep meadow. Jewish kids from the Lower East Side rode the trolley uptown to rowboats on the lake. Irish workers, sons and daughters of the same labourers who'd built the place with picks and shovels, walked the paths their fathers had laid. Progressive reformers pushed for more. They wanted playgrounds, ball fields, places where kids could actually play, not just admire scenery from a distance. In 1927, a man named August Heckscher donated money for the first fully equipped playground. Swings and slides on the southeastern meadow. It wasn't part of Olmsted's original vision. He'd imagined quiet contemplation, not screaming children on seesaws. But the city had changed. What people needed from the park had changed too, and maybe that was okay. The fights continued, of course. Some wanted to drain the old reservoir and build a sports arena in its place. Others pushed for a grand civic plaza connecting the museums on either side. Landscape architects and preservationists fought back, insisting on protecting what remained of the original design. Eventually, the reservoir site became the Great Lawn, naturalistically landscaped, the way Olmsted would have wanted. A compromise between progress and preservation. That's what the park became, really. A long negotiation between what the city wanted and what the city needed, between the rush of modern life and the quiet endurance of nature. By the 1920s, Central Park had become something more than a park. It was a symbol. Artists set up easels along the lake shore, trying to capture the way light fell through elm branches in October. The Impressionists loved the place, all those dappled shadows, the shimmer of water through leaves. They'd spend entire afternoons working on a single view of Bow Bridge, trying to get the reflection just right. Writers walked the paths looking for inspiration. They described strolls through the mall in novels and essays. The way the light changed as you moved from open meadow to shaded ramble. The sounds of children playing in the distance. The strange peace of being alone in a crowd. Photographers discovered something magical about the place. You could stand at certain spots and capture the skyline reflected in the water. Nature and city coexisting in the same frame. Trees in the foreground, towers behind, all of it mirrored in the still surface of the lake. Those images spread around the world. People who'd never been to New York's or Central Park and understood something about the city they couldn't have grasped any other way. That it wasn't just steel and stone, that somewhere in the middle of all that ambition there was room for quiet. The park showed up in songs, in poems, in the stories people told about what New York meant. On summer evenings, couples rowed boats across the lake as the sun went down. The water turned gold, then pink, then purple. The city lights came on along the edges, but inside the park the darkness felt gentle, safe. Bands played concerts at the mall, not the formal affairs of the Gilded Age, with wealthy families in their Sunday best. These were public concerts, free. Anyone could come. Factory workers and shop clerks and immigrants who'd been in the country less than a year. They sat on the grass or stood along the edges, listening to music drift through the elms. For an hour or two, nobody asked where you came from or how much money you had. You were just someone who wanted to hear music in a beautiful place. That was new. That feeling of belonging without having to prove anything. Not the immigrants' New York of crowded tenements and factory floors. Not the millionaires' New York of private clubs and gilded ballrooms. The other New York, the one that belonged to everyone. You could walk into Central Park with nothing in your pockets and still own all of it. The meadows and the lakes and the quiet paths winding through the ramble. Nobody could tell you this particular bench wasn't yours. Nobody could stop you from watching the sunset turn the water gold. That was the idea anyway. The dream Olmsted and Vaux had put into their Greensward plan all those decades ago. It took 50 years and countless setbacks, but by 1930 that dream had become real. Not perfect, never perfect, but real. Irish and Italian immigrants walked the same paths as the Vanderbilts and Astors. African-American families spread picnic blankets on the same grass where wealthy children had played with hoops and sticks in the 1860s. Working people and wealthy people shared the same air, the same shade, the same views, not always together. The city was still divided by class and race and neighborhood. But for a few hours each week, those divisions faded. In the park, everyone was just a person who needed a place to rest. The skyline kept growing around the edges. By 1930, buildings along Central Park South and Fifth Avenue had climbed 20, 30, 40 stories. The park sat in a canyon now, green valley surrounded by walls of stone and glass. But from inside the park you couldn't always see those walls. That was the design. Olmsted had planned it that way, using hills and trees to block the view of the city, to make visitors feel, even for a moment, that they'd escaped. The escape was never complete, of course. The elevated trains rattled nearby, automobiles honked along the drives. The city pressed in from every side, reminding you where you really were. But still, the birds sang, the water rippled, the leaves rustled in whatever breeze made it over the apartment towers. Nature, finding a way. The men who'd fought for this park were all gone now. Bryant, the poet who'd first demanded green space for New York. He'd stood at his newspaper office and imagined meadows where there were only muddy lots. He died in 1878, just months after dedicating a statue in the park he'd helped create. Collapsed on the steps of a friend's house. But his words lived on in every editorial about why cities need beauty. Downing, the landscape designer who dreamed of an American park before anyone else. He drowned in a steamboat fire on the Hudson, years before the first shovel broke ground. Never saw his dream become real. But his ideas shaped everything that came after. Olmsted, the failed farmer and journalist who'd found his life's purpose in dirt and trees and open meadows. He faded away in an asylum he'd designed for others, his brilliant mind finally going quiet. But his park spread across the country, teaching other cities what was possible. Vaux, the British architect who'd convinced Olmsted to enter that design competition in the first place, pulled from cold water on a foggy November morning, leaving behind bridges and terraces that would outlast every building around them. The workers who'd built it were gone too. Patrick, the Irish immigrant who'd broken rock and planted trees for $1 a day, he'd arrived on a coffin ship, lost everything to the famine, and then spent years shaping land that would welcome generations who'd never know his name. The German stonemasons who'd carved the bridges, the gardeners and labourers whose names were never recorded in any official document. 20,000 workers at the peak of construction, and we know almost none of them. The keepers who'd protected it through the lean years, Thomas and all the others, walking their rounds through decades of neglect, patching what they could, loving the park even when the city forgot to care. All gone. But look what they left behind. 843 acres of green in the middle of the most crowded island in America. Lakes that reflected clouds, meadows where children could run, paths that curved and wandered and invited you to lose yourself for a while. Bethesda Fountain, with the angel spreading bronze wings over the water. The Mall still lined with those towering elms. The Ramble still tangled and wild and full of birds. Bowbridge still arching gracefully over the lake. All of it still there. Still welcoming millions of visitors every year. Still doing exactly what it was designed to do, providing rest for the weary, beauty for the starving, space for people who had none. The story of Central Park isn't really a story about a park. It's a story about what happens when a city decides its people deserve something beautiful. When politicians and poets and landscape architects and immigrant labourers all somehow end up on the same side of an argument. When a community looks at rocky, swampy ground and sees possibility instead of obstacles. It's a story about fighting for things that matter, about losing those fights sometimes and winning them other times, about showing up year after year, generation after generation, to protect what previous generations built. The park faced more challenges after 1930. Times of glory and times of decay, Robert Moses and his playgrounds, the counterculture of the 60s, the dark years of the 70s when crime and neglect nearly destroyed everything, the restoration that brought it back again. But that's a story for another time. For now, just know this. The park survived. It survived corruption and politics and neglect. It survived economic collapse and social upheaval. It survived automobiles and skyscrapers and all the pressures of a city that never stopped growing. It's still there. Right now, as you're listening to this, 843 acres of green in the heart of Manhattan. The same grass Patrick planted, the same paths Thomas walked, the same views Olmsted designed to make people feel free, waiting for whoever needs it next, and you, lying there in your bed, comfortable and safe and drowsy. You're resting the way they dreamed New Yorkers would rest, in peace, in comfort, without the suffocating press of the city all around you. You have something those workers and keepers and designers never had. A quiet place of your own, sheets instead of straw, walls that keep out the noise, time to just lie still and let your thoughts drift. That's a luxury they fought to give people, a moment of peace in a world that never stopped demanding more. Take it now. Let your body sink deeper into the mattress. Let your breathing slow. Let the story fade into the quiet. Somewhere in New York, Central Park is settling into night. The last joggers heading home, the lamplights glowing along the paths, the lake going dark and still. The trees are there in the darkness, the meadows, the bridges, the fountain with the angel watching over it all, and the people who built it, who fought for it, who loved it. They're there too, in a way, in every stone Patrick hauled, every tree Olmsted planted, every path Thomas walked, every word Bryant wrote about the city needing a place to breathe. They're resting now. Finally, the way you're resting, and the park goes on. Let your eyes close if they haven't already. Let the story go. Let the quiet take you wherever it wants to take you. Sleep well. Tomorrow the city will still be there. The park will still be there. All that history, all that struggle, all that beauty, waiting. But for now, rest.